Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the Sharks trade deadline preview, a video I did last year, but in a completely different situation for the San Jose Sharks. Last year, they were looking to make a run for the Stanley Cup Finals, so they were buyers at the deadline. I was discussing which rental forwards they could look to pick up, how their assets would end up working out, they would trade, what draft picks they would get rid of. This time, however, it's pretty clear that the Sharks will not be buyers at the deadline, and really there are only two options here. Depending on how these last 12 games go post All-Star break leading up to the trade deadline, which is February 24th, a Monday. And so if those 12 games go decently, pretty good even, or anything worse than that, something like a 7-5 score, it's very likely that Doug Wilson does end up being a seller at the deadline. Now, if he has the Sharks put up a great record, something like 9-3 or even 10-2 during those 12 games, well, maybe the Sharks will stand pat. But in this video, it's kind of boring to discuss a team that's going to stand pat at the deadline. So I will be discussing whether, if it indeed ends up being the case that the Sharks don't have that great of a 12-game stretch leading up to the deadline and they still find themselves very far out of a playoff spot, it's likely that while they won't be able to unload any of their big contracts for obvious reasons, they will likely be able to trade some of their unrestricted free agents and potentially some of their restricted free agents. So starting off would be Brendan Dillon, potentially the Sharks' biggest draw. He was a defenseman who came over from the Dallas Stars a few years back now, in exchange for Jason Demers. I was a bit disappointed at the time because I did like Demers, and Dillon wasn't very good at the start. Of course, many will remember his 2016 playoff series against the Pittsburgh Penguins in the Stanley Cup Finals. He made up a pairing with Roman Polak, and that pairing was exposed time and time again when they found themselves on the ice against the speedy Penguins. But Dillon here in these past couple of years has really improved his game and become a pretty solid top four defenseman, at least on the defensive side. And he also brings a physical aspect of the game that some teams do miss out on. So with 50 games played, 1 goal, 10 assists, and 11 points, I suspect one of the first teams who could potentially look into him is the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, the Leafs at the moment are dealing with multiple huge injuries on the backside. Morgan Rielly, their top defenseman, is out for multiple weeks. Jake Muzzin as well, I believe, is week to week. And so they're left with a pretty depleted defensive core. And even when fully healthy, some of the criticism that was levied towards the Toronto Maple Leafs in the past couple of years when they lost to the Boston Bruins in the first round twice in a row has been that they aren't really a tough team. And so Dillon does bring that aspect to it. He can play that physical game, and he can still play as a top four role, maybe behind Rielly, Barrie, Muzzin. Dillon can be that fourth guy because, Cody Ceci isn't all that great. And so since the Sharks do have some trading history with the Maple Leafs, considering the fact that the Leafs were the team that supplied them with Polak, Reimer, Spalling back in 2016 for the Sharks Stanley Cup run, it could be something that is revisited here just a few years later. Another team that the Sharks could look to trade Brendan Dillon to would be the Winnipeg Jets. Now, the Jets still have some great offensive talent with the likes of Connor and Laine, Scheifele and Wheeler, and their goaltending with Connor Hellebuyck has really rebounded this season compared to the previous one, which wasn't as great for him. But it's no secret that the Jets' defense is extremely weak with the disappearance of Byfuglien, with Myers going to the Canucks. It's basically Josh Morrissey at the top, and then Neil Pionk a few steps behind since Trouba is also gone, and then some sort of no names. So Dillon could really help bolster that defensive core. The only problem would be that the Jets do still find themselves a couple points out of the playoff spot, but I do expect the Jets to try and make a push for the playoffs, and so them acquiring Brendan Dillon is certainly not out of the realm of possibility. And finally, I will talk about the Panthers. This is another team that could acquire. They're pretty set offensively. They got Bobrovsky and Nets, but their defense is, shaky, I guess. They have Ekblad, they have Yandel, and I guess they have Stralman, but Mike Matheson hasn't been great for the Panthers this season, and after that, a couple no-names. Mark Pysyk isn't all that great, so Dillon could help really round out the top four and give them a decent defensive core. So In exchange for Brendan Dillon, I doubt the Sharks can actually get a first-round pick. You take a look at some of these teams, I don't think the Leafs have their first-round pick since they traded it in the Patrick Marleau trade. The Jets, I believe, traded their first-round pick last season with the Kevin Hayes deal, so I doubt they'll try and do that again this season. And just judging by some of the trades made last year, I suspect Dillon might be able to get a second-round pick and then maybe something like a fourth with a condition, like if the team makes the second or the third round, it comes up to a third. So it's still certainly worth it if the Sharks are going to be sellers at the deadline to trade Brendan Dillon, but don't necessarily expect a king's ransom for him. Next, I will talk about Melker Karlsson, another one of the Sharks' UFAs. Certainly not with the same draw as Brendan Dillon, but could get the interest of some teams. 46 games played with 3 goals, 4 assists, and 7 points. And the first team who I'm going to talk about is the Avalanche. Now, the Avalanche are a team that is definitely going to be looking to make a Stanley Cup run. They were, a pretty big surprise actually to make it to the second round and even to Game 7 against the San Jose Sharks, and now they have pretty heavily improved during the offseason, getting Nazem Kadri. They got Jonas Donskoy, Andrei Burakovsky, and so the Avalanche could be making to make a run. They're in the bottom half in the league, however, in penalty killing, which is where Melker Karlsson could come in handy. Now, the Avalanche do have a lot of offensive depth, so Karlsson might not be the type of player who's going to consistently find his way into the lineup for the Avalanche, but if they want to try and shore up some of their, slight weaknesses here or there, and the penalty killing is potentially one of them for the Avalanche, picking up a player like Melker Karlsson for cheap, which he likely would come at, is not a bad idea. Next would be the Golden Knights, and before you click off the video, as I would suggest the Sharks trading with the Golden Knights, it's not the worst situation. Obviously, the Sharks' huge rival with the Golden Knights, but the Sharks do not play the Golden Knights again this season. If they are going to be making a trade like this, they wouldn't be playing them in the playoffs, of course, because the Sharks wouldn't be making the playoffs. And when you consider the history that Peter DeBoer, the new coach of the Golden Knights, has with Melker Karlsson, he certainly loves him as a player. This could be a trade that works out, and maybe the good news could be maybe Ryan Reeves gets pushed out of the lineup. I doubt it, but let's keep up hope. So if the Golden Knights, they could acquire Melker Karlsson. He could bring some of that penalty killing aspects that they do have. Obviously, DeBoer was very good when he was with the Sharks in this one area, basically, or at least this season that was the case. And so with the Golden Knights finding themselves also in the bottom half in that regard, Melker Karlsson could help shore up some of those issues. The offensive depth is decent for the Golden Knights, but Melker Karlsson being a 13th forward, if not like a 12th forward to play over the likes of Carrier every once in a while or Nosek every once in a while, is something that I could definitely see DeBoer liking and maybe vouching for the Golden Knights GM to make a move like that. And then finally, the Pittsburgh Penguins, another team that could acquire Melker Karlsson, not so much for the penalty killing aspect, but more so for that bit of a depth option, as the Penguins are somewhat hampered by injuries thus far this season. You take a look at their bottom six, there isn't a lot of name brand potential there. A lot of rookies. We're going into the playoffs. Maybe they're going to want a bit more of a more experienced, somewhat more veteran player. I know the Penguins GM Rutherford, when you take a look at some of the plays he's made in terms of trading and signing, you take a look at him getting Erik Branson, Jack Johnson, this season signing Brandon Tanev, that, it wouldn't be that much of a surprise if he would actually make a move to pick up someone like Melker Karlsson. Again, coming at a cheap price tag, I suspect Karlsson probably wouldn't demand more than, let's say, a 4th round pick, which seems kind of low. Certainly, in a 4th round pick is very unlikely to really pan out to be something. But in the offseason, the Sharks may or may not actually sign Melker Karlsson, so it's better to get something out of a player like this than nothing. Moving on to Kevin Labanc, who with 50 games played, 11 goals, 14 assists, and 25 points, I would say would be attractive to basically every single team trying to make a playoff push. I mean, maybe there's like a couple like the Capitals or the Tampa Bay Lightning who are really just super stacked in terms of their top 6. They don't necessarily need Labanc, but you take a look at a team like, the Boston Bruins, the Islanders, the Penguins certainly as well, the Stars, I'm sure even the Avalanche, the Blues, I'm sure would maybe even try and make a move for someone like Kevin Labanc, just because not only is he, a decent player who can play in that top 6, but of course he is an RFA, so he's on a completely very, very cheap deal, but you have all the negotiation powers when you go into the following year, unlike with Melker Karlsson or Brendan Dillon, where you're going to get this player and there's about a 99% chance you won't have him past those 20 games. There is a very good chance that you will be able to retain Labanc at a decently reasonable deal because, again, he is an RFA. However, In this situation, I really don't believe the Sharks should actually trade Labanc. I think it is a smarter idea to just keep him on the team and see what happens in this situation. I know a lot of people don't necessarily want to keep him or don't necessarily believe the Sharks will be able to in terms of just working it out salary cap wise, but I think it'll be a good idea to try and retain Labanc's services. Yes, he hasn't necessarily progressed as well this season as maybe some had hoped, but he is still a pretty decent middle six forward for the Sharks, and I think they're going to need that moving forward, especially since a rebuild will be tough to do without him. And then finally, I will talk about Aaron Dell, another UFA, but a goaltender. 19 games started, 8 wins, 2.9 GAA, and a .909 save percentage. Has certainly improved in these past few games to actually go from nobody would want to pick up this goalie to maybe there's a couple of teams in the making the playoff push who could potentially pick him up. Starting off with the Florida Panthers, of course, they made that huge move in the offseason to acquire Sergei Bobrovsky, but his playoff history, I guess it was very good last season, but prior to that, not so great, and Bobrovsky just as a whole hasn't been that fantastic with the Panthers so far this season, and when you take a look at the backup roles for the Panthers, there really isn't much there, and so I could see them potentially picking up Aaron Dell in a situation like this just to play as a backup just in case something goes wrong with Bobrovsky. And Dell has been pretty decent, as I said, in at least the past few games. And when it comes to Aaron Dell, I suspect going into this 12-game stretch leading up to the deadline, he should get the majority of the games, I would say, not only because he's been playing better than Martin Jones, but also because it could be a bit of a show-off opportunity for Doug Wilson to try and make him a bit more attractive for other teams to pick him up. Now, another team who could potentially consider him, the Vancouver Canucks. Again, trading interdivision isn't the most popular thing, but the Canucks do have Jacob Markstrom leading the way in terms of a starting goaltender, and their backup is pretty serviceable with Thatcher Demko. However, he is a very young player. I believe he's a rookie this season as a goaltender, so maybe if they want to go for a bit more veteran presence, especially in a thing like the playoffs, even though Aaron Dell is not the most veteran goaltender, he is someone who they potentially pick up. And finally, and maybe the most likely option would be the Toronto Maple Leafs. As I said, the Sharks were trade partners with the Maple Leafs back in 2016, and the Sharks picked up their goaltender at the time, James Reimer, for a backup role. And when you take a look at the Maple Leafs this season, they've got Frederik Andersen leading the way, and they're basically driving him into the ground because of the fact that they have Michael Hutchinson as their backup, who is potentially the worst backup in the league. And so they'll likely be very wide open to trying to pick up some sort of backup to try and shore up those issues, because the fact of the matter is that if you're going to play Anderson 60 plus games at this point, it's probably not going to work out all too well. And so Aaron Dell could be a pretty favorable option for the Leafs to pick up. In terms of a return for Aaron Dell, I suspect it'll probably also be around the 4th round pick. Maybe with the Leafs you can get them desperate enough, but especially since there might not be too many backup goalies on the market. But I suspect you won't really get much from him either way. So it seems as though the major prize would be Brendan Dillon in this situation, unless, of course, Kevin Labanc does end up being someone Doug Wilson does decide to trade. In that case, maybe you can get a first-round pick in return for Kevin Labanc just because he is that RFA. So the team that acquires him could actually make a move to keep him past this year. But, the Sharks don't have too much to work with, but it'll be nice to get a bit of a refuel of assets by moving some of these players who likely wouldn't find themselves with the Sharks again next season. Class dismissed.